First of all, I'd like to thank the Civil Rights Commission for inviting me to participate in this panel today. This is a terrific conference and a terrific panel, and I really feel fortunate to be able to be part of it. I think today should be a celebration. Imagine your legal and social status, your relationship legally and socially to other Americans, white versus black, if you were in 1650. Just think about that for a second. You know, how you would feel toward a person of a different race, what your different legal rights would be, what your different, your different social status would be. This were 1650. Okay? Now imagine that it's 1950 and how things are different in the way that you relate to the person next to you who's a different skin color, the way you relate to them as a legal matter and as a social matter. Okay, it's 1950, think of that, what that would be like. Okay? And now, think of what it's like in 2010, today. Think of how you relate to a person of a different skin color, your different legal rights, your different social status, the way you relate to that person socially in 2010. Now, if you can honestly do that exercise and not feel really good about where we are in 2010, then I don't think you're being honest. This country has done great stuff in the past 300 or 400 years when it comes to race relations. And I don't think we should lose sight of that big picture today as we go through the remaining challenges that we face. When we ask ourselves what we need to do with respect to race relations, and I'm going to simplify things. I'm going to be talking about blacks and whites. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But how do we, where do we want to end up? I think you have to, if you're analyzing sort of what's wrong with where we are and what needs to be done, you need to give some thought to where do we want to end up. How should blacks and whites be relating to each other? Where do we want to be ultimately? I don't think anybody wants or expects Americans to be literally colorblind, where you just don't recognize it. I don't think that we expect African Americans to forget that they're African Americans, that they have a different heritage than somebody from Ireland or Italy or someplace else like that. But I think that, a realistic goal is for being African American to be like being Irish American. You can be proud of being Irish American. You certainly don't try to hide or ignore that background. It's something you may celebrate, maybe more than once a year on St. Patrick's Day, but that's all fine. But certainly shouldn't affect what your rights are or how you're treated by other people. we don't expect all Americans to, eat the same foods, to, dance the same dances, listen to the same music. But, we do expect certain commonality of interests and respect among one another. And I think that that's, where we want to end up. Well, okay, so how are we doing then, if that's where we want to end up? How are we doing in our treatment of African Americans? Well, I think it's useful to divide into three parts the ways in which we've fallen short, and then ask how we're doing now in 2010. Now, the first and most obvious is the law. And I think that everybody would agree that we don't want to have a legal regime that sorts people according to skin color and what country their ancestors came from, and treats people differently, some better and others worse, depending on which box they check. And we've done pretty well on that, right? In fact, not only do the laws not, does the government not treat people differently on the basis of what box they check, with, ironically, perhaps the exception of affirmative action, which I'm not going to dwell on today. But, otherwise, the law does not make those kinds of distinctions. In fact, to the contrary, it prohibits private individuals and corporations and universities and so forth from engaging in that kind of discrimination in just about any public transaction, whether we're talking about education or contracting or employment or voting or public accommodations or credit, you name it. That kind of discrimination is illegal. You can't do it. Second big area is prejudice. Forget what the law says. How do Americans treat one another? Well, again, I think we've made huge progress. I don't think that anybody believes or asserts that there is no discrimination, that there is no prejudice. That stream is not dry, and it will never be dry. There will always be prejudice. People of all colors, some of them, will have prejudice of one kind or another. But I think there again, whether you look at public opinion polls or other kinds of data, the progress that we've made is enormous. I'll just tell one story. When my son started to college, he plays ice hockey. And one of his, one of the guys that he was living with, one of his roommates, was white and was dating a black girl. And we met the two of them, the couple that was dating. And then later on, we met Paul, my son, and told him, we met, your buddy and his girlfriend. He says, "Oh, you met her?" And he said, "Yeah." And he says, I don't know if I would want to date someone like that. And my wife and I sort of gulped and said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Oh, well, they're both on the track team. I just think it'd be really awkward, to be dating somebody, that was on, for instance, it'd be very difficult for me to date somebody that was on, my hockey team. I just think," and he said, "Well, maybe it's a little bit different because, track and field, you're not exactly, you're on the same team, but you're sort of doing maybe completely different things. Maybe one person's a pole vaulter and the other's a hurdler, so you're not really," anyway, that's the way the conversation went. That was the big issue, for my son. And, this is Southern Virginia. okay?